Our first speaker this morning is Willie Soon. Willie is formerly he's an astrophysicist at Harvard-Smithsonian, but thus he's a lot more than that. He's if there's a theorist for this whole issue of global warming and the things that surround it, it's Willie Soon. His knowledge is encyclopedic, and his energy never seems to quit. And he's a resource for fighting the warmers that is impossible to replace. There's no one else like him. Whenever anybody wants to really know about some aspect of this subject definitively, you call Willie Soon. So we're very fortunate to have him talk with us.
Okay, good morning. All right. Okay, son? All right. Well, before I get any further, I just thought that I better explain what my title is, which seems to be quite confrontational, which is not my usual style. But I really think that in this case, it really fits. And really that it is, let me just start by some very, very sort of basic facts that I would say that the Greenpeace, Al Gore, and myself agree, which is, a very unusual situation. The fact is that the world polar bear population, and remember, it's extremely difficult work to try to estimate the numbers of polar bears in the world. It is not head countings like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's completely not that way. It's just a very difficult situation. It is basically a technique that is really, you can say, subject to huge uncertainty. But the bottom line is that the world has about 20 to 27,000 polar bears today. Okay, that's the number. All right. And if you ask yourself, then, what other numbers do we know about the polar bears? There is another numbers that we kind of know, but it's with even bigger uncertainties. That would be polar bear population, let's say around 1950s to 1960s. That number is not very good, but we do know that they are definitely lower. The number that's been given around that I've been checked, I was able to verify some of that facts and talk to some really, really smart polar bear biologists, is that 1950s and 1960s, the number is about 5,000 to 10,000. So as you can see, in terms of everything that we know about polar bears, well, how is polar bear doing today? I would say fairly well, okay? And then here's where you explain how the environmentalists actually physically kill the polar bear, because all the arguments that you will hear about, or all the statements, I would just go to my punchline, of course, is that I want to sort of save that till the last. As you all may know, that the Department of Interior and U.S. Fishery and Wildlife Services has listed polar bear as a threatened polar bear species. And the only basis for that decision making is that the so-called ecological models predicted that given a scenario of future CO2 increase, that the sea ice will decrease and that the world polar bear population will die by about 2/3 of it by 2050 or 2045. This number, again, 5 years is a big difference for us, but those people, it doesn't matter. So that's how they kill it, right? Because reality is that the polar bears are doing fine, fairly wealthy, and then there's another aspect of it that is truly that the polar bear is under threat because the native population do hunt them. And then there are people who are interested in, at least just for hobbies and things like that, go hunting and that sort of practice, which is, I think, is commonsensical, is fine. But then that's the reason that explained basically why the polar bear population was 5 to 10,000 in 1950s and 60s, because they were overhunted. There was no sort of formal rule, no formal regulation, no management of how many polar bears should we kill per year and all that. But since 1973, there is this really the whole Circumarctic Agreement. Every single nation that owns any tiny polar bear populations has agreed to some sort of a formal, semi-formal agreement that's what we're going to do. We're not going to kill the polar bear in a sense that every year to the point where it's not sustainable, that the population will die off actually, right? Because ultimately we can really kill all of them, right? So this is why that, remember, if the polar bear's population really don't have the elasticity to really recover, they don't have to recover. The number doesn't have to be 20 to 27,000. It could be 1 per day today. But the point is that after we agree, after everybody agree, after some commonsensical approach to polar bear management, guess what? The polar bear population does bounce back to some significant numbers. And then the bottom line is that let's ask the most interesting questions about polar bear population. How many polar bears do you think the whole world can support given the current ecological situation and all that? I think this is a very difficult question to answer. But believe me, it's not 500,000, it's not even 100,000. The number, with a lot of my discussion, at least I was the first few to sort of poke that question even to some of those polar bear biologists. They were surprised, why would I ask that question? But I really want to know how the natural system would be able to support, given all the food resource and everything. That the number, I would say, the best numbers that I've been surveying around is that nobody says that you can support more than 50 to 60,000. So that's look at it. In that sense, this is why I say the polar bear's situation is healthy, and also that there's another facts which I'll postulate later. But let me now move on. Another point that I should clarify before I go even further is essentially to explain the quote of environmentalists. And by environmentalists, I also, in a sense, that want to do not abuse the English language and also do not abuse a lot of us who consider ourselves a good environmentalist. And these are some special class of environmentalists that you will hear more about later on. So this is really very strictly related to those kind of environmentalists who really essentially manipulate data, making implausible hypotheses and then try to cast them as some kind of science and all that stuff that is truly sort of revealing in terms of their intent, in terms of polar bears, in terms of how much they really care about the polar bears. And okay, with that I just proceed with the first famous environmentalist. This very famous environmentalist is, of course, our former Vice President Al Gore, and this is basically his formal statement in his book on page 147 to try to tell us the story about polar bears, how they are really doing today. Well, he really said that the melting ice is really a big problem for these polar bears, and then he says that, there's new scientific studies that show for the first time, and remember that polar bear has never been drowned before, so they've been drowning in significant numbers, okay? And of course, it's very rare in the past, and then, give the picture that, polar bear love the ice and they need the ice as a platform to go hunt for the seal, so if the ice is not there, polar bear will have to swim longer distance. Wow. I mean, if the nature were to be, the ecology is so simple, I really think there's not much else to argue. Really, I'll give it to him. Well, you will know, nature is a lot more complicated and more interesting than that. Okay, here, let's now check what the facts is. That's the significant numbers. 4 polar bears were found, and it's basically a paper that's been recorded, okay, during their survey of some whale migration situation in September 2004, where they found there are 4 dead polar bears in the Beaufort Sea shelf areas. Okay, that's what they did. They found 4 polar bears dying. And then, of course, Al Gore is saying that they're dying because they're drowning, they're suffering because the ice is not there, but, September is actually ice-free zone around that area. What do you expect the nature is supposed to do? And here's the facts. Here's one more fact that, of course, he didn't review. And actually, the source of that quote is actually come from this paper, of course. So that's what I mean. Well, here's what the author says. Well, it's not the polar bear died not because of them having to swim longer distance, because polar bears are well known to be a very good swimmers. Okay? And the main reason they die, 4 of them, is essentially because of this particular meteorological event that essentially have a very, very high wind, 15 to 30 miles wind, and then the wave height in excess of 6 feet. That's how they die, because under that condition, sustained for several hours, actually, this one is over 2 days, right, roughly. That's why they die. They die from that kind of condition. Nobody would be able, no matter how good of a swimmer or all that, or how hungry you are, you won't be able to survive that. So I consider that as an act of nature. Well, anyway, it's certainly not having to do with any global warming or sea ice melting. And here's now another fact. This fact now actually try to collect for you the best available sort of sea ice data around the Beaufort Sea Shelf area. Remember, polar bears really don't live in those so-called multi-year ice. They certainly don't sort of wander too far into North Pole. They never really have been seen that much in North Pole. They don't really go into those permanent ice area. They really prefer those areas that is very biologically active, ecologically active. Basically, they live around the shelf area from the land, so where they can really be able to find their food source, right? I mean, they don't live around those areas, so they live around areas where the ice are actually coming and going every year. That's the key point. And really that even if they say that some of the ice in permanent ice areas are melting, it really has no relevance to the polar bears, seriously. Okay? That's the kind of biology that is missing from that kind of argument. Well, as you can see from the measurements available on the coastal Beaufort Sea, I mean, where is the alarming sea ice melting and all that situation in Beaufort Sea? And this is actually a very hard to get data. You cannot get this kind of information from satellites, by the way. So you can only get this kind of information from in situ kind of measurements from the Canadian Ice Services. And now here's about the facts. Where is the global warming? As John Coleman would say, Al Gore, where is the global warming? I mean, this is the data showing you the global temperature measured by, let's say, the satellite measurement or from the what you call the land thermometer stations. And it's showing you data since the 21st century, right? I mean, clearly one would not be able to argue that actually the globe has been warming and therefore the ice is melting and then therefore the polar bears are suffering. There's no connections there in terms of the facts. And then if you look at the actual sea ice over the Arctic, here is the facts for the 21st century. Again, I plotted on purpose, I show this graph to show you the seasonal coming and going of the Arctic sea ice. When you look in that kind of absolute units, you will really, will be back to the ground base, the reality where really that, all the pictures that they show you of all this dramatic drop, just like the way they plot the CO2 curve, right? They don't show it from the zero, but they show it from 290 or 300 to make it really so much steeper and alarming. In terms of these seasonal cycles of the Arctic sea ice, I mean, I really don't think that you can find or argue convincingly that there is any significant sort of worries about the sea ice condition in the Arctic. And even if you do see some of this anomalously very high drop, let's say around September 2007, and guess what? I would just say that maybe I shouldn't be so bold to say that I offer any bets because I don't have that much money. But the whole point is that scientifically, this sort of low, this sort of sea ice low in September 2007 or 05, essentially have what you call meteorological and oceanographic explanation that has nothing to do whatsoever with the increase of CO2 concentration in the air. And the point is that this has been documented. They just don't tell you. One of the famous events was indeed that they detected a pulse of very warm water. It's called the warm summer Pacific water from the North Pacific. And these are pool of water actually at least 100 meters down that's been going in through basically the Bering Seas areas and then coming in and then get trapped. And I don't think that you can hit the water layers at that depth by CO2. And it clearly has nothing to do with CO2, and this is all meteorological phenomena essentially. Okay? So now, let's look at the other side of the pole, Antarctica. Antarctica is also, they don't like to talk too much about this, but I thought it is, although I'm talking about polar bear, we live in the Arctic, but I do want to point to a fact that if you look at the longest available sort of sea ice data from Antarctica, the news is also, if you love ice, it's fairly good that there's not much of a decreasing trend. I mean, you can argue all you want about anything, but in terms of the data, I don't see nothing. I'm so sorry if they say that the CO2, their prediction of CO2 rising will actually cause the Antarctic ice sheet to be less stable and all the ice melting. Here's one empirical data, and this is the data that we all know is universal. Almost everybody uses the same data, except they will tell you a different story. So here's the punchline. I think it's better that this polar bear say it than I say it. I don't really care what Al Gore say. I'm just Cole, because in terms of the last, 5 to 10 years, I mean, things are looking interesting. Maybe not for humanity, because coal, as you all know, is not so preferable. I mean, warm is slightly better for a lot of things. In fact, for polar bears too. I'll explain that in a minute. At least formulate my semi-hypothesis. And I do have to say one more thing, in the sense that, as I told Noah and Matthew Robinson this morning, I really do not want to be a polar bear specialist or biologist or anything. I really don't want it. I mean, I just do not want to do this. But on and off, I've been studying this for 3 years and ended up, I already wrote 3 formal papers. I may have 1 more paper documenting this. And I really do not want to do this. That was just publishing the paper was just my gentle reminder to the biologists and the climatologists, the ice expert and all that, to say that, please, let's come back to commonsensical discussion. Let's not, do all these kind of bad things that you are trying to do, that you think that you're helping polar bears. You're actually sort of killing them, right, in your model and all of that, but it doesn't fit the reality. How is your actions going to help the polar bear itself? So, I mean, this is why I really see that this environmentalist, the famous one is Al Gore, of course, is really doing a lot of damage by making that kind of really crazy stuff that I don't understand. I really offer it up to you that whether they require a gentle reminder or some kind of a very, strong spanking. I mean, that's be up to you, not me. Here's another very famous environmentalist. And this one is, of course, you all know by his name, is Jim Hansen. He's from NASA GISS. He's the director there for the Goddard Institute of Space Study. And you all have heard about our late colleagues, Professor Robert Jastrow, who I admire. And he's, of course, is the creator of the Goddard Institute of Space Study. And through my private conversation with him, he indeed said that he doesn't have that many regrets. His only true regret was to handpick this Jim Hansen to be the next director. In any case, here's what Hansen was trying to get into the polar bear business. Well, as you know, he's a man of many, many talents, so he's been speculating many things in terms of energy futures, in terms of how we should not use coal, and because if we use coal, it's like sending our grandchildren on that railroad tracks that is heading towards the crematoriums. You know what it means, the implication of Nazi, and he never backed it off, never apologized, never anything. And now here for polar bears, he essentially trying to point to 3 million years ago, which is the Middle Pliocene, that trying to point to the situation where indeed the globe was warm, and the sea level was maybe 25 meters higher than now, and there was no sea ice in the Arctic. And then he tried to use the image to try to create the picture that polar bears and seal would be, sort of push off the planet, extinction. Of course, as you can see, the real factual problem is that using that kind of pictures and trying to kind of use word to glue people's mind, it just doesn't work, because polar bear, as you know, as a pagophilic species, which is ice-loving, and I will tell you later that the ultimate enemy of polar bear is not anything but ice, are widely recognized to evolve from brown bears about 200 to 250,000 years ago. So, guess what? Polar bear didn't exist then. So he's trying to point to the pictures that Middle Pliocene is that warm and all of that, and trying to say that, well, species will go extinct. But seriously, we all love the species, really. We should do as much as we can to have as much as a species as we possibly can, including even species like Jim Hansen and Al Gore, those kind of species. But here's what the expert, this is a group of ecologists and all those people who truly concerns about, how nature works, how species evolve. And it's led by Professor Daniel Botkin of UC Santa Barbara, Professor Emeritus, who finally have the courage to write this kind of paper. This is a very good review paper who summarized the situation on projections of extinction rate. I think you can fairly secure to read it for yourself that there is little to worry about in that sense, because he essentially says that there is a lot of this forecasting suggesting that, global warming will lead to many extinctions, and then, but then he says the real surprise is that indeed over 2.5 million years, over 2.5 million years period, we really have not even been able to properly document one case of species extinction except for that one tree species. And then they also pointed out that indeed, that nature has that powerful force of has a mind of its own maybe it's related to the sun, which is my favorite, but then maybe it's related to just internal oscillation of the ocean and atmosphere system, that things can change quite dramatically. Here's the very, very useful sort of recorded facts that during time, let's say a time called the Younger Dryas about 11,000 years ago, where the temperature around the Greenland and northern hemisphere could really change by as much as 7 to 12 C. In fact, a famous oceanographer by the name of Wally Broker even say that the winter temperature condition would change as much as 28 degrees C. That's 56 degrees Fahrenheit. This kind of change. And guess what? All of that happened within 10 to 20 years. This is what you call rapid climate change. Okay, so, well, if you really think that CO2 can do that, I think good luck. But nature really can do it better in that sense. And then here's the reality. We're faced with this sort of large natural variability. Just deal with it and let's try to cope it. See, humanity can survive some of it, but it certainly has nothing to do with CO2. Now, here is what I'm trying to say about the ultimate enemy of this so-called Pargophilics species. The polar bears are indeed the ice itself. So the quick question to ask then, what data do we have to sort of look at this, examining this relationship within, the ring seal and polar bears, which is, ring seal, of course, is the main food that the polar bear consume, and sea ice condition. In this chart here, I simply, at the top and the bottom, which the top is essentially show you the information on ring seal, the bottom is basically on the polar bears' babies. And then the top two sort of bar there was to show you the year 1972 and 74, and then 1984 and 86, where you have very, very severe ice conditions, okay, around the Beaufort Sea area, where indeed during those times, instead of those populations doing better, you have decrease in the ring seal population, and then you have decrease of the polar bears' babies around. So really, this relationship is a bit counterintuitive, but then if you think about it, it's really true. When you have a lot of this sea ice, the access to food is really a lot more difficult. In fact, the ultimate question is that how do the polar bear really survive the last glacial maximum of 21,000 years ago, where the ice, as you know, on land could be at least as a few miles thick. They don't have a drill. They won't know how to drill this thing. So how are they going to survive? And the worst thing is that do not think about the picture only in terms of the ice. Think about the whole ecological system. The ocean need to support this food. So warm temperature is almost definitely will give you more marine productivities and more of this available food around. Even on land for sure. There'll be more wildlife, there'll be more goose, there'll be more berries, there'll be all kinds of things available. If you have ice, how are they going to drill the ice and get the food they need? So there is no doubt that during last glacial maximum, the number of polar bears should be substantially lower, okay? So warm is slightly preferable. The question is, of course, how warm? And I try to attempt to answer that later on with the small little hypothesis that I can come up with. And here is actually the statement from those polar bear experts who essentially tell you the same story that I just tell you. If you have the year where you have a spring ice condition that is fairly severe, there is this marked reduction in the production of ring seal pups and consequently for the production, at least availability of the polar bear's baby. So clearly that, and then of course they have observed these facts that you have seen it almost occur every 10 years or so. So it's also very interesting things that you see that this thing comes and go. You do see that, right? And then of course the polar bear could really die off if you keep having that conditions. But clearly that nature sort of like to fluctuate around a little bit, so things really were able to bounce back. So here's the picture that would summarize the essence that I'm trying to get across. For polar bears, I think essentially you do want to watch out for ice. Too much ice is really bad for polar bears. Okay? It is certainly bad for human beings, I'm quite sure, except for those skiers. But then when you have ice sheets, I don't think you like to ski that much. Now let me try to go about formulating a small little hypothesis that I do have, in the sense that the question is, of course, how warm should it be until where you think that there will be a serious threat to the polar bear? I would certainly say that completely melting of the ice is not good for the polar bear. There is no doubt. But remember that under any of the future scenario of CO2, has never sort of come close to what we have already observed in nature happening over the last 250,000 years. Under any time scale, under any amplitude that has been projected, let's say 2100 or 2150, all those projections they made has never sort of surpassed even the natural conditions that we have seen. So my argument is essentially that, well, we have seen polar bear sort of come as a distinct species from brown bear, has evolved sort of clearly since 200 to 250,000 years ago, and yet they survive all the high warm temperature during the interglaciers, during, let's say, even near the time of the so-called Middle Holocene, which is the Middle Holocene climate optimum. That time the temperature could be close to 2 to 3 degrees warmer than now, and yet they survive, right? And then the surprising thing is that they survive all the 2 glacial period that the Earth has undergone, the Earth history. So essentially, my point is that you don't really want to have, and then remember the ecosystem need to support a lot of these biological activities in order to really support this population of polar bears. So I would suggest that the current condition today is nowhere near optimal for the polar bear, which means they can grow a little bit more if it's slightly warmer. That's all I'm trying to say, okay? And I'll just quickly support it with this sort of, I would say, not quite a proper hypothesis, but I'll just offer it as a sort of a small little things that I could add to the topic. And here, I essentially want to base on this, basically a new data sets that come out from the northern Iceland, where a very high, good resolution measurements of the climatic conditions. I mean, the hardest part of this business is actually trying to estimate how much ice do we really have. In terms of trying to get the temperature or the sea conditions, we do have a little bit more sort of a useful way to try to determine this. But the ice is really one of the hard ones, which I try to feature here. So the data records from these particular proxies are able to show you that indeed, you're able to confirm this historical record, independently, of course, that from about, the scale is not so clear, but it's running anywhere from about 800 to 1300 AD. You have this warm period called medieval warm period. And you can indeed check that from that particular proxies, and these are the proxies that actually make directly by sea algae. You can replicate all this experiment. The more sea algae you have, you produce more of these IP25 molecules. And you have actually less sea ice during medieval warm period. And then, of course, the confirmations that during Little Ice Age, the period where going from about 1300 to 1900, that you get more sea ice around. Okay, so this is actually essentially tell you that story that, wow, we can confirm that facts. So the question is, how's the polar bear doing during those times? Of course, we don't have data, but here's the best I can do in terms of historical research. I'm always curious about getting more information. One thing that curious me was that I did try to search, not a very systematic search, but if anybody were to have counter evidence, please show it to me. And I really have not been able to find any mentions of polar bear during Little Ice Age period, at least by the Icelandic record or the Greenland record, the historical making. The 3 that I was able to find have some mentions of polar bear will be these 3 examples. And here's the first one is, of course, happening during the right in the warm period of medieval warm period from 1056 to 1060 AD, where there's this famous story of Audun, this little boy who actually spent all his money and buy the polar bears to present it to King of Norway. And then 1123, you got another example of mention of polar bears. And then 1274, finally, you have a recorded history of 22 polar bears landed ashore in Iceland. And of course, people eat them. So, yes, indeed, the question will be summarized in this cartoon again. So, how do polar bears keep warm in the winter is a key story, perhaps, because ice is ultimately their enemies. And I really try to propose that the reason why there's not much of this historical mentions of ice, polar bear in Iceland record during, let's say, Little Ice Age was indeed, there is not much of a polar bear to support. And then when you have more of this polar bear around, you're able to see. Remember, they don't have helicopters and all those. So, the chances of seeing them is also not as high as what we have today. So these people are actually seeing quite a few of polar bears around the neighborhood. So in that sense, I think at least that reasonably, the hypothesis can be rejected. So let's work on that, rather than all this pseudo-scientific work that has been presented so far. Now I'm going to get into the real part where I become really, really disenchanted with the process. This is actually a work that I have done with, as you can see, the name Scott Armstrong. He's a professor of marketing from Wharton School of Economics in University of Pennsylvania. Kirsten Green, which is a Kiwi, but then has a formal titles of working with the Monash University in Australia. So they love polar bears so much, I guess, that he has to work on this polar bear story. But here's a summary of what we did. But let me just back off a little bit. As I told you that the USGS and the US Fishery and Wildlife Services, and basically under the umbrella of Department of Interior, has been proposing that, we should, because of the environmentalists filing all these lawsuits, who really forced the US government to try to sort of enlist polar bear under the Endangered Species Act, right, that they're being threatened or under harm. And so to support that sort of decision, the US, the Department of Interior, the Secretary Kempton, of course, asking the Department of USGS to try to produce sort of 9 scientific reports to support that decision making. And as I told you that in terms of scientific argument, there's no scientific argument. Everybody agrees that polar bears are doing well today. So the key punchline of those USGS report was essentially trying to say that they are able to show that by 2050, the world polar bears will die off by 2/3 of it. So there's only 1/3 of them left. So our job then, and Scott Armstrong and Kirsten Green are two very, what I would say, very well-respected forecasting people. And Scott Armstrong in particular actually wrote, I would say, the Bible of the principle of forecasting. The book title is called Principle of Forecasting, where he essentially casts all these ideas about how to go about making a proper scientific forecast into 140 principles. And then to make it in the form in which that every sort of forecasting could be subjected to that sort of checking, whether they follow the rule or they don't follow the rule and that kind of thing. So, and he make it in a computer forms where, software that people can use them. I welcome everybody to sort of go around and do that kind of thing for whatever sort of forecasting that you want to check on it. So we just apply that sort of software and that principle by Scott Armstrong by examining 2 of the key 9 USGS so-called administrative report that basically offer the support for listing polar bear as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And here's our conclusion. I just want to focus you on the 2 red bullets. The first report we examined is done by this person by the name of Stephen Armstrong. Okay, he's the key guy, and I'll explain to you later. Essentially, when we examined the report, we found that they violated essentially 73 out of the 90 principles that we are able to rate. Okay? And then the report actually relies on only one polar bear expert to try to specify all the variables and relationship and inputs to their ecology model. The second report that is quite relevant to this decision making would be the report by Christine Hunter et al., a young mathematician ecologist who just graduated and got the assistant professorship at somewhere. And their report, we can show that it's violated 80 out of the 90 principles that we can judge. And it's based on their forecast for about 45 years, 75 years, and 100 years into the future. So, and then, of course, as you can see, the basis for the calibration was only based on 5 years of actual data. So that's how bad situation is. But then, as you all know, the bottom line, they have decided that that's good enough. And I'll show you what's wrong with all this work. Here is basically just a summary of the 2 reports and all the principles that we're able to judge that they base. By the way, the word contravene is also created during this process of trying to say that, we should not use very strong word. I love the word violation. It's just straight and simple. But then, Scott Armstrong is a believer in sort of a discussion. He's a good professor. He's very experienced. He's worked on this topic for 50 years, so I respect his opinion. I think, which I appreciate very much what Art Robinson was saying, that we should not call them liars. Like I say, if you want to spank them, you do it. I'll just be a little bit more gentle. And I think Scott Armstrong was quoting Abraham Lincoln on that. Ultimately, kindness will sort of will give them a objective, a calm down to try to look at the situation. So essentially, the bottom line is that, we found many of the principles were violated, so you could not possibly call those forecasts to be any proper scientific forecast. And then we sort of highlight on the viewpoint that it's only 10 to 20% of the principle will follow strictly. So that, and then just Scott Armstrong come up with that kind of question. How many occupations do we have in the U.S. that people are only allowed to follow only 20 to 20% of their rules during their day jobs where they can still keep their job. So it's fairly sort of an interesting way of putting this thing into perspective. Here is basically the three bottom line of what I actually found about the problem, the serious problem that I have been able to identify in those 9 USGS reports. Okay, the first things that I'll show you was just the 2 specific reports, but I personally have read all the 9 reports, which is a pure torture, if you can imagine. I will summarize it in this form. There is this strong conflict of interest and lack of scientific independence of the USGS studies, the 9 reports. There are biases and exaggeration beyond scientific evidence, understanding and uncertainties. And then non-standard scientific procedures and non-disclosure of scientific data. Okay? You can see whether you can still really call this a scientific forecast or anything that would be useful for policy making. The first documentation of that conflict of interest is that on every single one of the report, this is what they put on the title page. This is a USGS strategy. By the way, this particular report has a famous term. It's not really has been peer reviewed. It has a term that is called administrative report. And it's used to support this decision making. That's what they're essentially saying. When we point this out, they say, well, it doesn't really mean anything. That's the response. So I don't know what to make of it. You have to really mean what you say. I don't know what you're saying. You actually say that you're doing this report to support that, right? So I'm just going to interpret it as that. But now, when we pointed that out, they say, well, you're too strict. We don't really mean it. I really don't understand. These people are acting like a little child. This word has to mean something, or you take that off. Here is now the lack of independence documentation. If you check 8 of the 9 USGS report acknowledge direct fundings of support from the analysis from either USGS or US Fishery and Wildlife Services. And 5 out of 9 of them have support directly from both agencies. So since they always challenge me about what funding do I get and all that, in fact, I can give you another side notes. These are the things that I don't like to mention too much since you all are very dear friends, so I'll be very public and deal with you and mention it to you. In fact, there is one congressman from New Jersey who publicly having a hearing on polar bears and climate with the subthing right around October of 2007 last year, having a subtext because they know they've already been writing papers and my paper has been read by a lot of people and sort of a threat to them. So the sub-theme of the hearing in the House, U.S. House of Representatives, is indeed to say, what does an astrophysicist doing research on polar bear? That's the sub-theme. And having all these people parading, all of these are recorded, it's on tape, so go ahead and look at it if you want. But, basically, essentially parading and trying to say that I shouldn't be even researching this issue. I don't even want to answer to that kind of accusation. It's just silly. But anyway, this is funding issues. Now, I want to say that in terms of the system of networks and authors, the USGS report have a listed total of 36 authors, but only 17 unique authors. And I want to highlight Stephen Armstrong, which is a co-author of 6 reports out of the 9, and Eric Regeher, which really a fairly recent graduate, just got his PhD maybe 2006 or 7. Suddenly he becoming very, very prominent, and he studied under Stephen Armstrong. So guess what? And then, of course, the rest of the characters. Some of the names are fairly worth remembering, like Ian Stirling. He will be the king of polar bear. If anybody writing anything on topic of polar bears that go against him, you better watch out. I have a lot of, this is serious. This is not only me, it's almost anybody who wants to make any statement of polar bears that doesn't agree with him is in big trouble with Ian Stirling. Okay, I'll explain it later. Here is now what we do. As I told you, Scott Armstrong is a true gentleman, he's a true kind person, and when we wrote those papers, we thought of, write those things to ask them, why don't you comment and help us, there are certain things that are not clear in your report. Well, we cannot judge all 140 principles, we can only rate maybe 90 of them, there are a lot of them cannot be judged, can you give us more information? And here's the response. We all decline to preview your comments, but feel free to list us as you send your paper to peer review, as if we cannot publish them. And then, Here's a response from Eric Regeher when I wrote, Scott Armstrong wrote, my collaborators by the name of Marcus Dyke wrote directly to Eric Regeher to ask for data. This is the response. Thanks for your interest. I'm not able to comply with your request for data sets, and they are not available for distribution. And these are the kind of data where they're using to make that kind of decision under Endangered Species Act, and it's not open to anybody's independent assessment, or even at least just to take a look at it. Now I'm just going to play a short little quiz. I just want to put out two quotes, and this is one of the big quotes that I say, and I want to ask you, who said this and when? Okay, so that's the quiz. You're supposed to answer that. And here's a quote that says, polar bear specialists were concerned about future welfare of polar bear, but Tim Flannery, this bad guy, actually he's a very famous Aussie from Australia who actually won the Australian of the Year by writing this alarmist book on global warming, essentially with some expertise in biology and zoo. Of course, he has a specialist, so he's basically making that strong statement that polar bear could go extinct by 2030. Okay, and then this knowledgeable person also tells you all the full story, the natural ecology of polar bears. That same statement that I told you, that polar bear evolved from brown bear 200 to 250,000 years ago, and then they have been seen with temperatures warmer and colder than today. During last glacial interglacials, that's about 125,000 years ago, or the Eemians, where the summer temperature could be as warm as 4 to 10 degrees Celsius. Then today, this is the person who know all of that information. And then summer were 2 to 3 degrees warmer during the so-called Holocene thermal maximum around 6,000 to 11,000 years ago. Guess who says that? Well, the answer is Stephen Armstrong. He's the key guy who lead all this process. He's the biologist who actually have, in fact, they tried to erase one of the information which I got help from Donald Miller. He's the guy who actually, several years ago, who surveyed the Beaufort Sea population, was showing that they were increasing, and then they put it on the web page, and then it kind of disappeared. But I recorded some of that, and then Donald Miller was able to help me to get some of the original paper, which I didn't want to go through my library. I was just too lazy. But it was so nice for Don to be on top of this already. So here's what Stephen Armstrong, and he said that during November 2006. Remember that those USGS reports were released in September 2007. The timing is just amazing. There is no major revolution in polar bear science or understanding at all. That this person was happy to criticize all these people making alarmist statements, and then they come back with that kind of equally strong alarmist statements about how polar bear would die off. 2/3 of them will die off by 2050. And therefore, we have to quickly sort of make that rule in terms of listing polar bears as a threatened species. And then I also want to point out, and all this strange thing that I find in all this USGS report. If you really think what summer and winter is, it's not what it is. I'm sorry, you're just wrong. For them, winter just means anything from November to May. And it's a really spectacular claim. Winter can be 7 months long. Summer is either September only or September and August. This is actually what they formally meant in their report. So you got to really be careful when you read English words. Now I'm going to play a little of this forecasting game that Scott Armstrong, Kirsten Green, and myself created for the testimony of Scott Armstrong in the United States Senate, the EPW committee. And I didn't even want to put the label on these things, but I just say, if you look at these sets of data from about 1980 to 2006, please make a forecast for the rest of the 21st century. That's the challenge. Up, down, or whatever you want. The information is actually about the ice-free day in the southern Beaufort Sea, used by Christine Hunter et al. And the 5 data points they made to try to calibrate this sea ice and polar bear conditions. So the idea is that if you have longer ice-free day, then the polar bears population would go down because of all these problems, right, related to not able to hunt their food. If the ice-free day is shorter, okay, right, then the polar bear will do slightly better. But these are the 5 calibration points that they use to try to formally project 45 years, 75 years, and 100 years into the future. And they tell that these 2 data sets, you can distinguish them to be a bad ice year and good ice year. That's what they call it, okay? And they only rely on 5 data point. And they separate these 5 even into 2 more groups so that they can calibrate something. That's really a lot of work. And the first thing I pointed out is how about all those bad years, those really, really high, long ice-free days? Those years is extremely high. And also remember that they ignore 2006 data, which is really strange. Okay? And as you can see, maybe the reason is that it's under the good ice year. I don't know why they don't include the 2006 data, which they do have. And then finally, they admitted themselves. It's extremely difficult, they say, to try to base it on 5 years. This is the kind of a very strange scientific writing. They can always get away because half-truth is all that is needed. They admitted himself, it's difficult. 5 years, yeah, we know that, it's difficult. We already explained that in our paper. We defended all of that. But the point is that then don't do anything, please. You're not supposed to do anything after that. But they did it, of course. They said, nonetheless, we have this intensive study, and we won't be able to give you the data, that there's this relationship between declining sea ice and decreasing survival of the polar bear. That's the science, of course, they're trying to tell us. And then I do want to mention one very improbable hypothesis that I can assure you that is improbable. This is another study led by Stephen Armstrong and is used quite a lot. The idea here now is basically cannibalism. Wow, this is polar bear eating polar bears. And it has never ever happened before in nature. Okay? And this is a situation where recorded around 24th of January to 10th of April 2004 where they found, some of these recorded things about polar bears sort of eating each other, right? And then they hypothesized that those events are related to nutritional stresses accompanying longer sea ice season where have predominated this region. Of course, you have seen the data. I mean, you hardly can really make that kind of statement, isn't it? And the worst thing is that if you look at the timing of this situation, it's impossible to make the hypothesis. By 2006, Stephen Armstrong has had all those ice data. There's no chance of this really ice being related to that condition at all because 2000, 2001, 2002, and 2003 were all good ice years. Which there's no chance for them to accuse that this is all related to nutritional stress. And therefore, polar bear has to force to eat their own kind. That's really dramatic. I mean, just strong exaggeration. For my last part, I want to now address some place where we truly have a little bit data. This is the only place that have so-called better quality data of the polar bears and all this information about polar bear, which is in the Western Hudson Bay area. Okay? And here is one of the very, very famous paper who tried to give the ideas that if you study the Western Hudson Bay areas and you see the data, you'll be convinced that the population are dying off. And then that you can apply this whole situation for 18 other subpopulations in the circumarctic area. And then they say that it is unlikely that polar bear will survive as a species. Of course, they put if the sea ice disappear completely as predicted by some. That's very scientific language, who really is the usual kind of a lawyer writing. This is all science paper, unbelievable. And again, I call that a very nice word, tricks. It's a question mark to myself, because the only thing we know about even the actual prediction, which we don't believe in the first place, of all this GCM prediction, is that they only predicted September sea ice to completely disappear. Okay? So it is not that kind of a voodoo situation about disappear completely as predicted by some, but it's only September sea ice. Okay? And then let me point to what is the relevance of September sea ice for Western Hudson Bay, which the only place where we have very good, better control data in terms of polar bear population and all this information. For Western Hudson Bay, I have to tell you, if it's September sea ice, has nothing to do with whatsoever or any relevance in Western Hudson Bay. Okay? Because September is always the ice-free time for Western Hudson Bay, which I try to highlight. On the left there, you will see is the breakup time for the sea ice, which is around July and August. And then for the freezing of the sea ice is always around November to December. Okay? So during September in Western Hudson Bay, it's always ice-free. What relevance is all that future projection of September sea ice decreasing completely has anything to do with the polar bear at Western Hudson Bay? And I really emphasize that because those people were really emphasizing Western Hudson Bay because that's the only place where we can have real data to kind of talk about. And then I will try to show you the data, of course, whether you're convinced or not their statement is true. But those situations about future prediction is just crazy. It makes no sense. I pointed out to a paper. I have to formally write those and say it out. And then, of course, they just ignore it. And then they say that, what are you talking about? Well, what do you mean? This is the facts. Here is now the formal hypothesis that they do have. This one I give them a little break because this is the issues that I examine and write a paper about, which they suggest that the reason why this polar bear is suffering is because we have warmer spring temperature, which caused the sea ice in the western Hudson Bay area to melt slightly earlier every year, so that the time in which that the polar bear has to spend on sea ice is a lot less, so their ability to access food is a lot less, and therefore blah, 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 as John Coleman would like to say it. So they suggest that, well, this ultimate cause of polar bear demise will be related to this earlier spring ice condition, like melting earlier and earlier in western Hudson Bay. Okay, so that's related to this long-term warming trend in April to June atmospheric temperature. Now let's try to go and look at all the data. Well, anyway, I want to say that also, and that paper was written by that famous biologist that I mentioned to you about, Ian Stirling. Again, nobody crossed this guy. This is just someone to say, from hypothesis to advocacy and alarmism. This guy, I no longer believe that he's a true scientist. I know that he loved the polar bear. That's true, but then it's also not justify his behavior. Well, he go around, of course. By the way, he get most of his funding from World Wildlife Fund. Any fund that he can get from World Wildlife Fund International, World Wildlife Fund Canada, World Wildlife Fund North America, he got all of the fundings from World Wildlife Fund, if you talk about funding and being biased. So this is, of course, as you know, the group and he provided more details about how the weight of the polar bears were losing weight and therefore they're suffering. And I was telling Noah and Matthew Robinson, do you want to know how they measure weight of polar bears in the field? They have fancy name. It's called quarterly body mass index and all that. It's just taking your fat skin and doing that. That's it. That's the measurements. That's the information they have. Let me just point it out that Western Hudson Bay is just one of the 19 subpopulations, so it's made up only 4% of the world population. So if you find even anything on this particular population, it's really, really unwise to generalize for the whole population of species of polar bears in the world. But regardless of that, let's look at what Western Hudson Bay data. Here's another one. Here's another quote from Stirling et al. This is a paper that actually attacking my paper, so I already replied it to that, so it should be really interesting to read. And I welcome anybody to read both of them to see, who is right or who is trying to, play with the words. Well, anyway, they say that, the monitoring of this Western Hudson Bay population has continued, and in this paper, Regerer et al., we have documented the decline from about 1,200 in 1987 to 935 in 2004. This is actually a very famous number that's going around. This is the only number they have to try to suggest that we have some drop, and they call it significant drop in the polar bear population numbers, and this is the only thing. But the word trick indeed comes from these things. This is the actual data with the error bars, sort of formal error bars being plotted, and he's highlighting 1987 and 2004. And then, of course, he's not talking about 86 and 85. He says that the data there are bad. Okay, that's their excuse. And then, of course, they didn't even give the formal statistical confidence. If you were to use the full statistical confidence, I think it's really difficult to even suggest anything further. But I invite you to, of course, to think about how to really talk about this statistically to have anything meaningful in terms of saying that the population is suffering, it's dropping significantly. And I'll show you more tricks, of course, of what they do. Why do they stop at 2004? Here is now the sea ice parallel. As you can see, the sea population is dropping, and the cause of that to them is related to this earlier breakup of the sea ice in Western Hudson Bay, which is shown by the data point. And they stop at 2003. This is actually from the paper. And I have no doubt whatsoever they already have information for 2004, 2005, and even 2006. And those 2 points are not there. And this is the way they play with data. And these are the things that I don't even know how you could even escape any peer review. So there's no peer review in this kind of situation. It's all peer endorsement. There's nothing else to that. And then here's another very strange thing. In this paper itself, it's a pure torture, by the way. It's a lot of words. It's a lot of words, but with very little substance. They say, well, we're studying this. We're so careful that we even investigated whether the survival was a cumulative function of environmental condition over several years. So they say that they use this so-called 3-year running means. If you all know anything about statistics, if you have 3 points, and then they call it center 3 years, that's the key word. Essentially, they're trying to tell you that the future can predict the past. So this is all this gobbledygook that I don't understand, and you call that a biology paper. I don't know what it is. But that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with. Of course, those kind of error is not pointed out in any peer review during their peer review. Now I want to put up a quote. Okay? I want to put up a quote just to reaffirm my point, because after all, I'm not the polar bear biologist. This is actually, I now consider him a good friend. His name is Mitch Taylor, and he has been working with us, with Bob Ferguson. We are the few who actually was able to go into the Department of Interior to try to sort of tell them all the stories. They knew about this, of course. We keep telling them, and it just, doesn't matter. You can tell them anything you want. But anyway, they just wanted to make that decision. And this is just a situation in which I want to document that Mitch Taylor, who is also an expert, but of course, if he go taking that kind of position with scientific data, he's quickly been shunned out from all this polar bear specialist committee. One of the most amazing things that they recently have done to him is that this guy has been studying polar bear at least as long as Ian Sterling. So he studied for 40 years, Ian maybe 50 years. And he's been on those polar bear specialist committee for almost 25 years at least. Guess what happened last year? This year, they start dropping him off from the committee, so he won't be able to even have a sort of one dissenting opinion in 10 of them. So they just kick him out from the committee. And well, here's what he said. He said that, well, we know that low number in 1950s. This is just trying to reaffirm what I told you. Okay? And then this population has been showing, you see, this is showing the new estimates from this. Another population used to be thought to be 900, but all of a sudden become 1,500. Okay? So we really have a lot more polar bear all of a sudden, but you know that this is all basically the difficulties are estimating polar bear. And then I just want to quickly tell you that, well, here's more information produced by Sterling himself, where I don't understand when they say that the 900 numbers, 950 in 2004 is low, where you have all these old numbers that they estimated so low before. And that's a kind of a puzzle that one cannot answer. And then I'll quickly go over this situation on sea ice. If you really look at the sea ice under the proper way, which is the upper panel, I think it will be less alarming, because sea ice just come and go in Western Hudson Bay. And then based on that data sets, that is actually taking only the spring sea ice, spring breakup ice, they were able to show some kind of a trend, that is decreasing trend that they say supported the decrease in polar bear population. But let's just quickly look at another site, which is the southern Hudson Bay, the southeastern Hudson Bay, and look at the sea ice data. This is very nearby and share almost the subpopulation, because the polar bear really don't know the boundary. They can migrate across boundary. And for the eastern Hudson Bay, you are not able to show any statistical significance. So that's the kind of things that I think you should really worry about, all these large regional differences. And then guess what? They are extrapolating this to all the populations in the world. And then this is even more puzzling. This fact has been known also for a while. If you not talk about the sea ice cover, if you talk about the sea ice thickness, the Canadian Ice Services is very good in documenting data. And for the Western Hudson Bay, you may be very surprised that they're even able to find statistically significant thickening of the sea ice. And so it's, and then of course they say this is against the GCM, and therefore the GCM should be held accountable, blah, 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 and all that, but it doesn't matter still. What is all this sea ice causing all this polar bear to suffer? Well, your sea ice is thickening. And here's now a little chart from my paper where I documented the available air temperature data for 4 seasons, but let's just focus on the spring data, the spring temperature data according to them. And the red line, and that's the data that show from about 1930 to about 2004 or so, 2002, where you can see that the place where they make the hypothesis, the former hypothesis by Sterling et al., was only focusing on that region. The red bar there was showing you the warming. But if you look at the larger sense of all the data, you really are not able to support that kind of significance. So my answer to that question, whether is the surface air temperature around Churchill warming up significantly, I would say no. Okay? And there is actually a parallel situation where one needs to consider. Instead of sea ice melting up earlier, let's say that if the sea ice is actually freezing up later and later, remember that they have to come on shore. They're really suffering now. They're very poor. If the sea ice actually freezes up later and later, they would suffer a lot more. Okay? But if you look at the temperature, you don't have that condition to support it. That the sea ice the fall temperature is not warming up that significantly. This is now my 3 formal conclusions that I can make where there is actually data to assess anything. The rest is all numerology and all these wordings. So my conclusion on the polar bear population is that I do not think that they suggest any alarming decline in numbers. When I look at the sea ice condition, I don't think that they can suggest any strong earlier spring ice breakup, and data record are just too short. And there are large variability and then big differences between region. In terms of air temperature, I certainly do not see any rapid warming trend that they were claiming. And of course, they were focusing on very narrow region to make their hypothesis. So as you can see, that this sort of cherry picking just don't work. I'm sorry. And then it is a very irrational word and decision. And on May 14, Secretary Kempton decided that, well, showing all these beautiful satellite pictures of no sea ice in the Arctic and saying that, well, we have to follow the law, that we have to enlist polar bears as a threatened species under ESA. So I'll just end with this paragraph from the polar bear themselves. Thank you.